This is the story of a woman who changed a nation by running an illegal business out of her 258 square foot apartment. Today's story is called The 4 Words That Made Her a Billionaire.
Season 2 of the story features 12 trailblazers who started a business that changed the world. The story is brought to you exclusively by Salesforce, the world's #1 customer relationship management platform. More than 150,000 businesses are using Salesforce to blaze their own trails to success. And now, on to the story.
The knock on the door made her jump. She wasn't expecting anyone, and her heart began to race. As she tiptoed over to the peephole, she peered through. It was the police. Again. She glanced around at the inside of her tiny apartment. Every available surface was covered with pictures and files of her customers. And it was all illegal. She cracked open the door and asked if anything was wrong. The police calmly informed her that she would have to come with them. She was going to have to answer some questions. She sighed and then slid out of the door. She locked it and followed the police to their car. 30 years earlier, World War II was raging. In Japan, everyone was part of the war effort. In the early mornings, the sound of wooden practice swords echoed through every town. The swords were being swung by young children. Children as young as 9 were learning how to fight, and if necessary, kill. The older teenagers were all at work in the factories. Just like in America, they were told that their patriotic duty was to work long days to make supplies, guns, bullets, and bombs. Propaganda was all over the newspapers, the airwaves, and on every street corner. Everyone had to be ready to fight and sacrifice. That meant everything and everyone was going to work tirelessly until the war was won. One young girl couldn't figure out why there was such an obsession with the death and destruction. When she was 6 years old, her father died. The loss crushed her, and it wasn't long until she hated the war effort. But what she hated even more was the fact that everyone around her seemed to enjoy preparing for it. Her father had been a well-admired and respected school headmaster. Her family had been safe and secure, but her family had been dependent on his income. His untimely death threw the family into poverty. Now the little girl's world turned dark. What would her family do without her father? How would they get the money they needed to eat and survive? Her mother told her not to worry, but it was easier said than done. After that, it wasn't long until the war effort fell apart. Japan had lost. The girl tried to make money and help her family however she could, but it was almost impossible. The economy was in shambles. And then, Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened. After that, it was all over. Society collapsed, but somehow, the little girl and her family managed to survive. In the newspapers, they were told that the enemy would arrive and kill them all, but that day never came. She didn't know how anyone continued to function under all that pressure, but somehow her mother did. Despite the madness during and after the war, her mother continued to work as a midwife. She worked every single day. Each morning, the young girl would wonder if her mother would return, or would she simply disappear like so many of the other adults. But her mother always returned. She would continue to mourn the loss of her father, and she would never remarry. The girl watched her mother's iron will and became determined. She respected her mother deeply, and like so many children, she wanted desperately to please her. When the girl graduated high school, her mother beamed with pride. She had single-handedly raised a child in the middle of the most catastrophic war in history. She had managed to keep her alive and help her graduate from high school. When a man asked her daughter to marry him, her mother was ecstatic. The young woman said yes. There were no other options she could see, and she was worried that a no might crush her mother. Her marriage worked for a while, but soon she grew restless. She didn't love her husband. To be blunt, she didn't even like him. In her marriage, the only things she was allowed to do were a narrow range of housewife tasks, nothing else. She longed for a challenge, but that was forbidden. Divorce looked like the only way out. She knew her mother would never allow it, and neither would the rest of society. In those days in Japan, women didn't initiate divorces, but a man could get a divorce anytime he wanted with just 3 simple lines of a letter. The price for being a divorced woman in Japan was steep. It would be almost impossible for her to get a job, and her family would be shamed, and she wasn't going to be welcomed at any social engagements. Besides, could she really put her mother through anything else? Despite that fear, she trusted her gut, and she decided to pursue the divorce. Her husband was shocked, but eventually he accepted. Her mother was crushed. The feeling of shame the girl felt was replaced by a new feeling: freedom. The feeling was intoxicating, and the young woman reveled in it. But soon she found that she wasn't doing anything except lounging around at the house. Her mother had sacrificed so much to give her this chance at a better life. Now she had freedom, but she was wasting the opportunity. Finally, she summed up the courage to go out into the world on her own. She was broke and she didn't have a job. But meanwhile, she wanted to see if she could actually make any of her big dreams happen. But something was still holding her back. All throughout her years of growing up, she heard the same thing. Women only worked the boring jobs. And the boring jobs tended to be soul-crushing. They were the repetitive work that no one wanted to do. The young girl wanted to do something exciting. She wanted to be part of something that was bigger than herself. But when she went out to look, there were no opportunities in Japan. She'd been trained to hate the enemy, but there was a different message starting to trickle into Japan. Not all of their enemies were bad. Some of them were decent people. And besides, there were rumors that the Americans were pouring money into rebuilding Europe. The call to adventure beckoned, and the young woman planned a trip to Europe. Her mother begged her to reconsider, but the girl had to get out and see the world for herself. After working the boring jobs long enough, she had scrounged enough money for her Europe trip. Soon the day came, and she left. The stories she heard about these people weren't true. Yes, they were strange, but Europe was fascinating, and so was England. During her travels, she came into contact with hundreds of new people and new ideas. As she looked around, she realized she was swimming in opportunity. The standard business practices here were nothing like those in Japan. In Europe, the jobs that they considered boring were fascinating, and the young girl found that there was a business called a temp agency that would allow her to go from job to job. She couldn't believe it. She was going to get paid to work and learn at jobs at the cutting edge of all kinds of different industries. What she really couldn't believe was that all of the Europeans hated these jobs. In Japan, people were expected to have the same job for life. Why didn't these Europeans realize how lucky they were? It wasn't long before she was the star of the temp staffing agency. All kinds of temporary job offers came her way. She accepted all the ones that sounded interesting and got to try out dozens of different industries. Once she had some money saved up, she moved from England to Australia. Once again, she experienced a radically different work environment than Japan. After a while, something was pulling her home to Japan. She was ready to return, and she knew exactly what she was going to do when she got there. Inspired by her time abroad, she had the start of a business idea. She was confident that her idea would resonate with the people at home. Back in Tokyo, she rented a 258-square-foot apartment, the size of a small walk-in closet. There, she set up a temp staffing business. Technically, that act was illegal. In Japan, it was expected that you worked at a company for life. The idea of temporary employment terrified the government. But she didn't care. She had seen the future abroad, and she knew it was only a matter of time until Japan modernized. But the cultural change was slow, and so was business. Other Japanese women weren't enthusiastic about the concept of being a temporary employee. Disappointed, but still hopeful, she began teaching nighttime English classes to pay the bills. It was hard, but she managed to keep her dream alive. After 5 long years in that tiny apartment, she was finally able to move her business into its first office space. The way she saw it was that Japanese women were trapped in a terrible cycle. Most of them had to quit their jobs after they got married. Sometimes their husbands weren't comfortable with it, and other times they felt society's crushing expectations that they become mothers. Her company offered a new path for women. Instead of being forced into a lifetime career or having to give up work altogether, she offered women a chance to work part-time and in different jobs. It might sound simple, but at the time, it was revolutionary. In those early days, she only hired female workers. It was the 1980s, and she noticed that the company's sales were slowing down. Many of her employees were uncomfortable going out and seeking new business opportunities. They were worried that they'd be fined or arrested for spreading the idea of temporary work. Temporary work was still against the law, despite the woman's lobbying efforts to change it. The woman grew frustrated. So how could they carefully grow the business without getting into trouble? Up until this point, she had only hired women. What if she tried hiring men? She tried it, and soon she had a company culture where women and men were in perfect balance. Her business grew. Despite the success, lifetime employment continued to be the norm in Japan. The government continued to advertise that under the law, temping by private companies was illegal. On one particular day, the knock came to her door. When she went to the peephole, it was the police. She glanced around at the inside of her tiny apartment. Every available surface was covered with pictures and files of her temporary employees. It was all illegal. She cracked the door and asked if anything was wrong. The police calmly informed her that she was going to have to come with them. She had some questions to answer. She sighed and slid out the door, locked it, and followed the police to their car. She knew this day would come, and as the police walked her to the car and to the station, she laughed to herself. When she got to the station, she made her case, and somehow, they let her go. She had talked her way out of it. After that, she was frequently summoned by the police, but each time, she was let go. With each release, she grew bolder. She had seen the future. Her entire country might believe that what she was doing was wrong or illegal, but she knew she was right. She knew that one day there would be a tidal wave of people who agreed with her. Sometimes she would lay awake in bed at night and wonder if she was going to be thrown in jail. But that day never came. Eventually, after all the years of work, lobbying, and arguing with the government, she won. The law was changed. Temporary employment became legal in Japan. Little did the woman know, but she had positioned herself perfectly for a macroeconomic tidal wave of opportunity. It was the 1990s when Japan entered what is known as the lost decade. Businesses went bust and the economy tanked. Every single business needed one thing: temp workers. The woman's business, Temp Holdings, was now large enough to give them exactly what they needed. It wasn't long before Temp Holdings went public in 2008, and soon it expanded around the globe. The little girl who had craved freedom and had sought it out in Europe had found it, and she brought it back and shared it with her culture. That woman was none other than Yoshiko Shinohara. She became Japan's first self-made woman billionaire. She says that there's one mindset above all the others that helped her do it. I hate to lose. Those 4 words helped her become a billionaire. They prove that business doesn't have to be complicated. She felt the call to adventure, followed it, found the future, and brought it back and shared it. Not only did Yoshiko blaze a trail for others to follow, but her business has helped millions of women explore what it's like to be more free and independent. She didn't wait until she had a glamorous office or until the government gave her the thumbs up. It's easy to wait. It's easy to complain that things aren't fair. It's much harder to start trying to fix things from your 258 square foot apartment. That's a struggle, especially when you have to struggle for 5 years. And you have to risk jail time to do it. Yoshiko was a pioneer. As Emerson famously said, if you are right, you are a majority of one. Yoshiko's story is a reminder that if you know that you're right, place a bet on your idea and yourself, you might be a majority of one. That's her story. What's yours going to be?
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Story. We have an exclusive giveaway for our listeners: 2 free tickets to Salesforce Connections in Chicago on June 12th through June 14th. Salesforce Connections is the digital marketing, commerce, and customer service event of the year. You'll learn how to create personalized experiences at every touchpoint and deliver service that drives growth and exceeds consumer expectations. Head to thestorypodcast.com and enter to win today. That's thestorypodcast.com. Thank you again to our presenting sponsor, Salesforce, for sharing these stories of business trailblazers who changed the world.
If you like this episode of The Story, please help spread these stories by telling one friend. Also, you can hit the subscribe button on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. The Story is created by our team here at The Mission. The Mission is your #1 source for accelerated learning. To get more stories and podcasts like this and our world-class newsletter, subscribe at themission.co. That's themission.co. See you next time.